Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of Method Ministries, where we do talks, debates, interviews, and more. And I have a very special guest with us today, Dr. Keith Stanglin, and we're going to talk all about Jacob Arminius and even after Arminius. So, Keith, welcome, and thanks so much for being here.
Yeah, thank you, Lucas.
Yeah, my pleasure. You want to go ahead and introduce yourself for our audience?
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, as you said, I'm Keith Stanglin. I teach historical theology at Harding School of Theology in Memphis, Tennessee. But my full-time ministry is with the Center for Christian Studies, and that is a nonprofit ministry that that produces resources for churches. Basically, one of our mottos is scholarship for the church. So we produce good resources for equipping church leaders and people who don't go to seminary, but still lead, usually in a lay capacity, as Bible teachers and other things in churches. So it's Center for Christian Studies with a cool mug too. So
Awesome. And I have both your books here too, just for the audience. I'll leave these descriptions. Hopefully they can see them. But you did, as you can see, you did Jacob Arminius and you did after Arminius. So you did like how much study would you say that you've done on this topic of just this studying, Jacob Arminius himself and then what happened afterwards?
yeah, it has been the main focus of my scholarly writing, for sure. It has been a very small part of other things and of my sort of church ministries. But yeah, it's been the bulk of my scholarly production, I would say. I've done probably, including those two, three, four, yeah, 6 or 7 of my books have been in some way on Arminius or Arminianism. And then I continue to write. I have another book under contract that I hope will be done in a couple of years. But essays, in books on Arminius, I'm sort of constantly asked to write up those essays. So yeah, it continues. It's not, I would say, the focus of what I do anymore, but certainly early on in my career, starting 23 years ago. Yeah. When I started reading Arminius and writing on him, starting with my dissertation, my PhD dissertation, it has never ceased. So.
Well, you're definitely the man for the job then, and your books have been very, very helpful. So thank you for them because they helped me out too to understand this topic. So can you run our audience through starting with Jacob Arminius? What is his life and what happened? If you want to give us like a brief biographical sketch of him.
Sure. Yeah, Jacob Arminius was a Dutch theologian, first a pastor. He was born and raised in the northern Netherlands in the late 16th century. So he went to study, as many people did at that time, in different places, different cities and universities, including Geneva. He was there too late for Calvin, but he did study under Calvin's successor in Geneva, Theodore Beza, among other professors in other places as well. In 1588, he was ordained as a pastor in the Reformed Church in Amsterdam. So he returned to his homeland and served as a pastor there for the better part of 15 years. When there was a vacancy, there were actually 2 vacancies of 3 in the theological faculty at Leiden University, which is just south of Amsterdam. He was called to fill that one of those positions, and so he became a professor in 1603 in Leiden, and remained there until his death in 1609. So actually, he was a pastor for more than twice the length he was a professor. If that gives you some context for his own theology and interests as well. So so that's sort of just the basics of his life. He was a pastor and a scholar. His theology, just brief summary here, and we can dig in as much as you like to any of these points. But he's most famous for his what were at the time controversial views that did not fit well among the majority of his Reformed contemporaries, in particularly in theology. So he's most well known for contesting some of the points having to do with Reformed doctrines of predestination, what generally goes by the name of Calvinism. Okay? And I would say especially on the points of Calvinism that are usually summed up as unconditional predestination and irresistible grace. He contested those vehemently, and was opposed by his own colleagues during his lifetime. But I will say that he died in good standing with the Reformed Church, and was not like pronounced a heretic or anything. That came later. That would come, but he was controversial, but a pastor and professor in good standing with his church. So that's sort of the bare overview there.
Yeah, thank you. And so he came from the Reformed background, right? And he always professed to be Reformed, never, and always actually even argued that way too. Like, correct me if I'm wrong, but he argued that his teaching was in line with Heidelberg Catechism. Was that it?
Yes. We don't know much about his very early upbringing and his when he was a child, except that he was raised by a single mother. His father died before he was born. But yeah, at some point very early on, he was associated with the Reformed Church. He went to Reformed universities and seminaries. He ministered in the Reformed Church, and as such would have subscribed to definitely the Belgic Confession, which was the Dutch Reformed Confession, and also the Heidelberg Catechism. So when he was in fact, even before he was a professor, but certainly after his time in Leiden began, he was asked, along with others, to submit to the synod any sort of questions or problems that he had with the confession and the catechism. And so he did call for a close review and potentially revision of those, what were then recent documents from the 1560s, both of them. But yeah, as a pastor and professor for the Reformed Church, definitely he subscribed to those. And as you or your listeners, may or may not know, I don't know, those documents don't come out with, certainly they're not supralapsarian, and they can be read in such a way that it includes kind of Arminian take. But I would say also it's sort of difficult to get it, which is why he can subscribe to it, but also says maybe we need to be a little clearer about some of these things.
Was it a myth that Jacob Arminius was at one time an actual Calvinist? Like isn't that not actually known?
Yeah.
So okay, so that was a myth.
Yeah. So the story is from very early on. Actually, is that he was a strict Calvinist, and and part of that goes along with this idea, which is also, I would say, a myth, and that is that Beza in Geneva forced all of his students or coerced everyone somehow into supralapsarianism. That's just what sometimes goes by the name hyper-Calvinism today, right? That doesn't seem to be the case. There seems to be a little more toleration and leeway in Geneva for the theological students, though Reformed Calvinism was sort of the norm, and that would be expected. But where you fit on some of these questions about the order of decrees and everything, there doesn't seem to be any coercion there. But yeah, the story was that then, while he was a pastor, that he changed his mind, actually, when he was called on to write about these issues. But Carl Bangs, the biographer of Arminius in the late 20th, cast some doubt on that story. There's certainly no evidence that Arminius was a strict Calvinist, or that he was anything other than just what was common in the Netherlands before the rise of Calvinism in the 1560s, and that was sort of a soft, at best, predestinarianism. So yeah, I would say it's unknown. I don't feel strongly about it as Carl Bangs did, that was just a myth, but certainly there's no evidence of his strict.
Yeah, maybe it was to cast some doubt on, oh, he was kind of just like seen as this apostate from Calvinism. I don't know if that was some people's take, but I'm sure some people could spin it that way.
Yeah. So yeah, it's unknown, we'll say.
Great. Yeah, so let's walk through his theological beliefs. So, start, soteriologically. So, Arminius, people often think that Arminius or Arminianism is this Pelagianism or semi, Pelagianism. So can we start with like his doctrine of total depravity or original sin?
Yeah, sure. He certainly confessed a doctrine of the fall. So he's not a full-blown Pelagian. And I don't know of anyone who knows anything about Arminius or Pelagius, for that matter, that would call him a full-blown Pelagian. So he held to a pretty robust doctrine of the fall and its consequences, and was, open to using the phrase "original sin" that Augustine coined back in the day. He seems to have defined it, I would say, a little differently than his Calvinist or Reformed colleagues would have. He seems to not be a big fan of original sin as original guilt. So when it comes to original sin, as let's say in its strongest definition, it is that the guilt of Adam's sin is inherited, and of course, as Augustine hypothesized, passed on through sexual reproduction to all in the human race. So he would say there's no such thing as inherited guilt. So what we inherit, in fact, are the consequences, the punishment, you might say, of that original sin. And so we're born with fallenness. We are born negatively affected in every part of our human nature. So whatever makes up our human nature, our intellect, our will and affections, and of course our physical bodies, all of these things have been negatively affected by that original sin, and we inherit that. So that's his view of depravity, is that we have a total inability to turn to God on our own in this fallen condition. And said like that, it's very close to the Reformed doctrine of total depravity as well.
Would his denial of original guilt, would that be in terms of, Orton Riley, who was a Nazarene theologian, he defined it in terms of man is liable for Adam's sin but not culpable. Would that be in agreement with Jacob Arminius?
It could be. I mean, Arminius doesn't use that distinction in that way, liable versus culpable. He certainly would say, he certainly would affirm that we're not culpable for it. But I'm not sure what Wiley means. Would you say Wiley or Miley?
Orton Riley, I should say.
Wiley, yeah, with the W, yeah. So yeah, he doesn't use the category of liable there that I recall. But yeah, I mean that would be close, I think, to what Arminius would say here, is that liable in the sense of, at least, I mean, we receive the consequences of it, and you can think of other, areas of life where you receive the consequences of someone else's bad actions. It doesn't mean you're culpable for it, but you do, you suffer for it, and so.
Yeah, because I think he did. Jacob Arminius, from my memory, defined it in terms of deprivation, where man is born into this lack of of state deprived from original righteousness, and therefore bent on sin. And so, to clarify, he would use the term or agree with the motif of total inability, correct? Like, and therefore be in agreement with Reformed theology.
Yeah, yeah. So the original sin is a deprivation, as you said, a privation of the removal of original righteousness that Adam and Eve were created.
Okay, great. And so the next thing I want to ask you is about prevenient grace, and this is the big one, in both the Wesley Arminian, broadly speaking, broad category, because I know there's a little bit difference between Wesley's understanding of it, but what is Jacob Arminius' understanding, his teaching of prevenient grace?
It's in many ways what Augustine and the Reformed would have said about prevenient grace. So this category, prevenient grace, even though it's usually used by Wesleyans now, and a lot of Reformed people think it was some sort of Wesleyan or even Arminian invention. This is inherent and really very ancient in the Christian tradition. So Augustine certainly talks about prevenient grace. All that means is the grace that comes before. So both groups, both sides of this debate agree that grace, special grace even, must come before conversion. And that's the beginning of the process of conversion. That's the beginning of faith, is God's grace. So only the full-blown Pelagians would deny some sort of prevenient grace. And even they would probably use the term just to mean creation and law. But so Arminius believed that God's grace must work on a person's heart. Now, the main difference is in the nature of that operation, is that in that for Arminius, it is a resistible grace. Now, the prevenient grace it's given, let's say, unconditionally. Right? The prevenient grace is given to everyone, or it's available at some degree for everyone. But from then on, a person has a choice whether to resist that grace.
Did he believe, like Wesley, that God has given this grace freely to all, like kind of like by de facto of the cross of Christ, or was it at the moment of when they come in contact with the gospel proclamation?
Yeah, Arminius does not specify that. That's one of those questions I wish that he had been a little more specific. I mean, there's a lot of questions I wish he had more time to write about, but that one in particular is kind of a question that is very significant, I think, to this idea of prevenient grace. Is it universally offered? And then if so, how? He just doesn't say. Yeah. So it'd be speculation to answer it one way or another. But he does believe it's somehow universally available. Now, some of that might get into his doctrine of middle knowledge, but again, he doesn't tease it out that way. He doesn't address that question using the doctrine of God's knowledge. But it could be, God knows ahead of time who's going to accept this grace or not, and so he makes sure that they have the gospel preached to them and all of that. That's a possible resolution to that, but he doesn't talk about it.
Yeah, because I think one of the things that happened with his life is that he was cut short in his life, so he didn't have this time to develop some of his doctrines, which, as you mentioned too, which is interesting. He held to the doctrine of middle knowledge, like not fully. So he wasn't a Molinist, but he held to some type of middle knowledge that he was opening to using. But wasn't it just like, again, like his life was cut short, so he didn't really get to develop that more?
Yes, that's correct. I mean, he died at the age of 49 or 50. The date of his birth is contested also, which year it was. But yeah, around the age of 49, 50. As I said, he was a professor for just under or just about 6 years at the University of Leiden. So most of his writings that we have actually were written before he went to Leiden, were written while he was a pastor in Amsterdam. If you just look at the page numbers, the majority of what he wrote was written then, and really all of it was published after he died. So he never got a chance to write a systematic theology. It was in his plans, but you sort of have to piece together some of these things And yeah, he was reticent when it came to middle knowledge for various reasons.
So what is this doctrine now of conditional election? Is it corporate? Is it individual? Like, how did he understand that? And how did he argue for that from the scriptures?
Yeah, so conditional election just means that, in contrast to the Reformed view, it just means that God chooses those that He knows will accept His grace. So election just means choosing, and the question is, on what basis does God choose? So for the Reformed, they would say it's unconditional on the human side. God has His reasons for choosing this or that individual, but we don't know them, and it's certainly not something within the person. God is looking at a mass of damned humanity because of their sin, and so He chooses certain people. He has His reasons. We don't know them. Every person is just as deserves just as much condemnation as anyone else because of sin. Arminius simply is saying that we have a say in this. That's all he's saying here. We have a say. It's not a meritorious say. It's not something that we deserve or something as elect, but it's simply that this gift of grace is resistible. And so it's sort of like salvation or election might be defined as those who refuse to resist the gift. God is offering the gift, and accepting it is simply a refusal to resist. It can be resisted, but it's someone who simply leaves the hands open that you might say God has opened for us, gives that grace to us. We accept it. Those are the ones God chooses. And so the choosing, the election in some ways is corporate. It's part of the eternal decree. The eternal decree is simply that God is going to save those who accept this grace and don't resist it. And so if that's you, then there's the individual part of it. So it's not either corporate or individual. It to be both. Yeah, the corporate is in the decree itself that you're a member of this body of the saved, the body of Christ, if you accept this grace and the gift of faith. But God knows the individuals, of course, and how each will respond to this gift of grace. So there's an individual aspect to it.
Yeah. So how did he respond now? Because when people hear that language, in particular, Calvinists, we have a part in it, or we choose. They think, that's Pelagian. So like how would Jacob Arminius answer that question to say that it was still like would he still affirm that he was monergistic? Like, because me as a Wesley Arminian, I still say I'm a monergist. That is, salvation is all of God. I know many true Reformed classical Arminians do. So like, how would he respond to that, or how did he respond to that?
Yeah, he responded in several ways. He was accused of semi-Pelagianism, even in his lifetime. That was also sort of a new word that was being thrown around from the mid-16th century on. And it was intended for synergists. People often think of the semi-Pelagians as the 5th century opponents of Augustine. But that's anachronistic in some ways, though we call them that. The word was invented in the 16th century, and it was invented for people, by the Reformed, for people like Arminius and other synergist Lutherans, let's say. So yeah, he was accused of this, and basically he denied the accusation that accepting grace is a meritorious thing. I think one of his most clear responses to this is an analogy he uses. He calls it a simile. It's about a beggar. So if a beggar receives alms from someone, all the beggar does is receive it. Someone comes and gives him, let's say, $10,000, and he just receives it. Would the beggar, after receiving that money, say, well, I contributed to this because I put my hands out and I put the money in my pocket? So I'm partly responsible for receiving this. Or would he say, I could receive this gift or not? I could have this gift or not have it based on my choice. All right. Well, that second way of putting it maybe is technically true, but he would never say, hey, I'm partly responsible for this. I did percent of the work, in this. And so it's like we wouldn't say that about a beggar who received a gift of alms from someone. The beggar wouldn't say it. We wouldn't say that about this situation. How much more would that be inappropriate to say about the grace that God gives us simply because we receive it? So he, at the end of the day, he just says, if you want to say that refusal to resist, that acceptance of the gift, if you want to say that that's work, okay, but that's not the way the New Testament uses it when it opposes faith to works. That's not the way the Christian tradition has used it. And so if you want to call that semi-Pelagian, if anything, if Augustine is on the extreme over here, and Pelagius himself is the other extreme, and there are other ways of working out in between on the continuum here between that. And you want to say that anything on, I forget which side was which, anything on this side of Augustine is semi-Pelagian. It's one quarter Pelagian, it's 1/8 Pelagian. He says you can do that, but that now at that point the term has lost all meaning and it's just an insult. He said that's what it is, and so
It's a boogeyman.
yeah, exactly. You can call me that, and you can do that with a lot of heresies. Anything if the heresy is overemphasizing a truth to the exclusion of another side of that claim or that truth or that paradox. If it's an overemphasis in one direction, then any believer can accuse someone else who's just on that side of it, that side of the emphasis can accuse them of that heresy. That's been done throughout church history a lot, and to good effect.
Yeah, because even on the opposite side too of that, where people have no problem saying, or Calvinists have no problem saying that man was offered salvation and rejected it, and therefore there's this compatibilism if they want to go down that route. But if you reverse that, then it's like, oh, you're a Pelagian. But again, if you can affirm this side of rejection, that man rejects God's offer of salvation, then why is it wrong for us to say that God by His grace can allow us to accept His salvation? I do like how and I think it was in, I forget which book you talked about it, but Arminius was very heavy on predestination. He talked about these order of decrees, which I love about him is that he's very Christocentric. So he would say that Christ is the first elect, and he would argue that man isn't saved by this decree, but by Christ. So Christ is in this afterthought, as in, okay, I'm going to save people, and then I'll throw my son in. It was, I'm going to save people by my son. So Christ is all of election. Would that be accurate?
Yes, I think that's right. And that was one of the accusations that he and his followers made against the Reformed order of decrees, is that, yeah, it does seem like God has not only reprobated, but also elected people for salvation, and even in some sense regarded them as saved before he even decrees or considers Christ as a part of this. And so, yeah, it does seem like Christ is on that schema, is subordinate to the decree of election and is simply a means for this. Whereas, yeah, for Arminius, it all begins with Christ. There's no election or salvation without already considering what God has done in Christ.
Yeah, because what I loved about his argument was that phrase "in him" in Ephesians 1:4, and he argued, I forget the terminology, but it was object relativity or something like that. Or basically, he argued that and that man was in Christ before election, and it was predicated by that phrase "in him," and therefore he was chosen in him.
Yeah, it's just that election is modified by that phrase grammatically, but also then just in reality is conditioned by being in Christ. So you see the same thing, and I believe it's First Peter 1 as well, and other places where election is mentioned. I would say it's even alluded to in Romans 8, that those he foreknew, he predestined. So it's people who are in Christ. Those are the ones that God chooses to save.
Yeah, so so basically, this is not an argument of, or this is not a controversy of free will versus predestination as it's been depicted.
Oh, right, yeah. Arminius certainly, yeah, one of the most common misunderstandings or ways to sum up Arminius that you'll see in some even survey textbooks is that Arminius rejected the doctrine of predestination. No, he rejected a doctrine of predestination, namely the one that he would argue was novel in the church and didn't really start until the 5th century, until Augustine, and is unknown in church history before that, and never really caught on in the Eastern Church and other threads within the Western Church either.
Before we move on to his followers, do you think that Jacob Arminius, because I know he did not hold or didn't take a firm stance if man could fall away from the faith, do you think he would have went in that direction where he would believe in conditional security?
I believe that he was fairly clear about it. I wish he had been clearer on this, but I think he sort of struggled with the question. But I've argued in probably more than one place, but certainly in a couple of books, that he did think that a true believer can fall away from the faith, and it's just a logical. I mean, I'm not sure how you can say that that irresistible grace, is something God doesn't do. God doesn't give His gifts irresistibly. He gives His gifts persuasively, and that grace doesn't override nature, but it perfects nature, as Aquinas said. I'm not sure how you can say justifying grace must be resistible, but sanctifying grace is irresistible. All of a sudden, the operation of grace changes, and you can't give it up even if you wanted to. All of a sudden, once we're regenerate, now our choice is taken away to renounce Christ or do something else that is inconsistent with the gift of salvation and the grace that God offered. So there's the sort of the logical point, but Arminius certainly in several passages takes that logic to its conclusion and gives examples. David, after he sinned with Bathsheba, the Spirit was taken away from him. He was not in a saved position at that time. Peter, after he denied Christ, these are examples he gives, but they were restored to salvation. So part of the misunderstanding stems from a bad translation of a very pivotal passage in his Declaration of Sentiments, which is Arminius' most accessible and most read document. That's where people go first to read his views on things. And where he talks about this question, there's a mistranslation there. And I've talked about this in my book on assurance, my first book from 2007 on this, and I think it came into the Jacob Arminius book with Oxford there that you had. So if people want to know what's going on here, I would just point you to that. But yeah, he thought that a true believer can lose salvation and be restored again to it with repentance and confession of sin and all of that.
Interesting. Okay, yeah, because I was going to ask you, why is there that misunderstanding where some people seem to argue that some people don't? But so thanks for clarifying that, because I always argued too that even if he didn't affirm it logically, he would have went there, and you can see that even in his followers. Like there's no way logically out of that you wouldn't eventually hold to or affirm conditional security.
Yeah, and as you say, yeah, his followers went there as well, but it was controversial. I mean, part of it is just. He's reluctant to say things that he doesn't feel 100%, about. If he has any doubt about it, he will say that he has some doubt about it. I don't know that he's necessarily trying to fudge anything, but he's just, expressing where he has some doubt, and that's easier to express when it's going to be controversial. I think that's part of it. And he doesn't want to leave the impression that people can fall in and out of salvation like that, which is the other extreme, I think, that some anti-Calvinist types have taken the life of sanctification as, you never have assurance, you're always in or out, that's not what he's suggesting.
Absolutely, yeah. All right, so let's talk about his followers. First of all, how do you say the word? Because some people say it differently. Like I say it, the Remonstrance. Am I saying that wrong? Or like, is there an accurate way to say that?
That's the way that I say it. I think that's the way we usually say it in English. If you go to the Netherlands, the Remonstrants themselves, when they're speaking to you in English, they will usually say Remonstrance. So, but yeah, I go with Remonstrance.
And that word means protesting, right?
Remonstrate just means to disagree, dispute a certain point. So to contest.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, because I was going to ask that. So they were disputing the points of Calvinism, even though at that time Tulip wasn't around, but they were disputing that.
That's right. Yeah, they were disputing certain interpretations, typical Reformed interpretations of the Belgic Confession, Heidelberg Catechism, and they were saying we have. So this happened in January of 1610, less than 3 months after Arminius died. 43 Dutch Reformed pastors who were sympathetic to Arminius' views signed a document that said, we want to be able to teach without reprisal and with no punishment or consequences. We want to be able to teach these 5 things. And so these are the 5 points. They were first the 5 points of Arminianism. These 5 points, and they sign it, and that became known as the Remonstrance, CE at the end, the Remonstrance of 1610. And so they signed that, and then the Calvinists in the next year contested it, and so they were the Contra-Remonstrants, and so that debate went on. But that's where that name comes from.
So it's almost like you can in a sense argue that they were, the current Calvinism was a development within the Remonstrants themselves. So they were going to define themselves as contrary to this.
Yeah, I mean the whole thing is under let's call it the Reformed umbrella of Protestantism that was clearly defined by the 1560s for sure with this confession and catechism. And the whole debate is what's going to fit under that umbrella. And so with the schism that was the Protestant Reformation, every fellowship, every Christian communion in the West in the 16th century was going through these same debates and questions. What does it mean to be Roman Catholic? Okay. What does it mean to be Protestant? And then here's this umbrella of Lutheran, this umbrella of Reformed. So that's what's happening here. Every communion is having these debates. And this is the most significant one in the Reformed Church. And it's just playing out, and they're going to make a decision, by 1619 that these people are in, these people are out. But every communion is drawing the lines that had been blurry much more clearly, so that there's a black and white here. And Arminius and his followers are trying to say, we are safely under that umbrella. And if we need to kind of define the umbrella a little bit, broaden it a little bit, fine. But we're under. And I'll just sum it up like this: if supralapsarians get to fall under that umbrella, the hyper Calvinists, let's say, if they get to fall under it on this side of it, then we surely ought to be included in the Reformed camp on this side of it. But those fences ought to be drawn outside of these lines, right, and include us. What ended up happening is the supralapsarians, even though it's not in the confessions what they believe about these decrees, it kind of tends against supralapsarianism. They were in fact included, and the Arminians in fact were excluded.
So there was politics involved, right? Because you mentioned how they wanted to say, hey, we want to teach these 5 points and without persecution, because I think what people don't realize is that if you study them, they were heavily persecuted. They were outcast. They were exiled. Some were. How many of them were actually put to death? Was it Hugo Grotius?
No. So it certainly was political. I mean, I wouldn't call just the persecution and marginalization that happened in Arminius' lifetime and shortly thereafter. I wouldn't call that political persecution. This is the sort of marginalization that happens when people just, persecute on an individual sort of social level. Okay, it's a social marginalization. Yeah, it became political very quickly. There are lots of things that led up to this, but I'll just, you can sum it up that in 1618, Maurice, the prince in the Netherlands, basically instigated a coup d'etat and took over the government. And part of that was his devotion to the Calvinist side. So he took a side. Everybody sort of had to take a side on this issue. It had been just getting worse and worse throughout the 1610s. So he took a side on it and ended up executing. The one who was executed was Johann von Oldenbarnevelt. He was an elder statesman, and basically you might say something like the main leader in the Netherlands. And it's not really an analogy in the United States for his office, but he was imprisoned on trumped up charges of treason, actually, and executed in 1619. He was the main, and I want to say the only one executed. Certainly as a political point, it was not for a theological point, but it was related, right? And it was seen at the time, even by most people, as trumped up charges. He is a hero, for the Dutch today. I mean, they realize what was happening here. But yeah, many remonstrants. So the result of the Synod of Dort in 1618 and 19 was that basically the remonstrants were put on trial, and by the end of it, their points were countered by 5 articles of the canons of the Synod of Dort. And that's sort of a precursor to the 20th century tulip. Of course, they didn't use the word tulip, or that came later, the 5 points of Calvinism. But they were a response to those 5 Arminian points. But many of those remonstrants, the remonstrants were forced. If you're going to stay here, if you're going to be a minister in the Reformed Church, you have to sign off on these canons of the Synod of Dort, which basically condemn the Arminian points of view. And you have to promise, even if you're not a minister, you have to promise not to speak out against these points. So would not do that. Many would not sign that. I want to say 300 or so were exiled. Others were imprisoned. So Hugo Grotius was one of he was sort of Secretary of State. He was very high up in the government under Oldenbarnevelt. He was imprisoned, and many others. Grotius, in fact, escaped from prison. If he had not, he might have been executed or died in prison, but he escaped. Very famous story of his escape through a book chest.
That's like a St. Paul escape.
Out, yes. So yeah, that's right. It was a really dramatic story there. But these remonstrants went into exile, mostly in the southern Netherlands, in Belgium, Antwerp, and France, other places, until there was more toleration throughout the 1620s. By 1634, they were allowed to come back officially, and they opened their own seminary, the Remonstrant Seminary in Amsterdam, which continues to this day.
Is that very liberal, that seminary? I think I might have heard that, or was that incorrect?
Yeah, so the Remonstrant Brotherhood, they're called, that was founded as a result of their excommunication from the Reformed Church after 1619. became after that a group that was very much open to, as many groups were, but they in particular open to Enlightenment, rationalism, and the Enlightenment side, not so much the pietist side of the subsequent centuries. And yeah, we're on the forefront of liberal Protestant theology in the 19th century. And then they are, basically from the 19th century on, I would say the most progressive, if that means anything to your audience, progressive Christian denomination in the world. So when it comes to social issues, when it comes to Trinity, all of that, I mean, and it's, I think it's sad in some ways, but that's been their trajectory. And part of that, as I argue in print, is simply because a group that's excommunicated and is not bound by the, when the Reformed say to them, you're not a part of this church, and you're not, as part of that, you're not bound in any way to the Heidelberg Catechism anymore, Belgic Confession, and certainly not the Canons of Dort, then they're sort of forced to come up with their own confession of faith. And they're sort of forced to have social and ecclesiastical interactions of their own. And so what do persecuted groups do? They often get together. And so there's a lot more interaction with what would be sort of proto-Unitarians, Anabaptists and Mennonites for sure, but all of those Socinians is what we called them in the 16th and 17th century. But there was a lot more interaction there and less, let's say, sort of gates and boundaries and guardrails around orthodoxy at that point. So that happens with group. When the Orthodox, quote unquote Orthodox, kick you out, it kind of sours you on orthodoxy.
Now that was not the original Remonstrance, right? Because Simon Episcopus, if I'm saying his last name right, he was the main follower or the one who spearheaded the 5 points of or the confession of Jacob Arminius, or the Remonstrance, I should say, right? And so they were in line with orthodoxies, basically like when did that liberal split kind of happen, where it started progressing more so towards this rationalization and enlightenment, because they were within bounds of orthodoxy when they had that confession.
Yeah, I was just giving an overview of kind of what you were saying. What are the Remonstrants still around today and all that. So I was just, all of that subsequent history. But as I indicated, it's sort of gradual. It really takes off during the Enlightenment, so late 17th century. But just as in any movement that is, any intellectual movement that is alive and vibrant, there is continuity and discontinuity with Arminius. So with that, you can detect it in Episcopius himself, and you start seeing some of this for sure. I mean, there is openness to Socinian biblical interpretation.
What is Socinianism? Can you explain that for our audience?
Yeah, Socinus was a writer. He was a theologian, late 16th century, Italian originally, and immigrant, and very influential in Poland, and basically think anti-Trinitarian. So he was on the forefront of what would later be called kind of liberal Protestant theology, but it was radical. I mean, you would George Huntston Williams puts him under the umbrella of the radical Reformation of the 16th century. That's neither Roman Catholic, but also neither Lutheran nor Reformed nor Anglican. So these are all the others. And the radical nature of this was especially, or at least the extremist and controversial point, was the rejection of the doctrine of the Trinity, and particularly the deity of Jesus Christ. but also there were they had controversial views on the atonement, particularly if Christ isn't fully God. But also, what I'm pointing out here is a doctrine of the interpretation of Scripture, which is very much what we would look at today as kind of historical critical, kind of a proto-historical critical interpretation of Scripture. So the Remonstrants are on the forefront of that. The Remonstrants are on the forefront of religious toleration in the Netherlands and in Europe at the time. They are the ones that they are very much interacting with the leading Enlightenment figures. It's one of the Remonstrant professors, Etienne de Courcelles, who is a friend of and translator of Descartes on the rationalist side. It's Philip van Limburg, the very famous Remonstrant theologian from the late 17th, early 18th century, who is a friend of John Locke, the British empiricist. It's hard to know when you look at Locke's philosophy if it's more Locke influencing Limburg or if it's Limburg influencing Locke. That's how close they were on their thoughts. So they're just very much into the Enlightenment. Now, some will say, well, that's part of the Arminian legacy and whatever. That was all sort of inherent in Arminius himself, and then it came out in his later descendants. Well, there are pockets of the Reformed Church who are just as much fans of the Enlightenment. So it's not something that's peculiar to Arminianism. That was these sort of what would become, skeptical conclusions. And as I say, proto-liberal Protestant theology. You see it in the Reformed and Lutheran churches as well. So it was just part of the air breathed.
Because I know they were accused of being Socinians. So, just, for the audience, maybe they don't know this. I recently discovered this myself. They held to the Remonstrance, it seems like along with Jacob Arminius, a form of, or the belief that Christ was not autotheos. So just for the audience, what that means is autotheos means he doesn't have that aseity. So he receives that or is communicated by the Father. So would they hold, is it correct to say, Keith, that they held to the monarchy of the Father, and therefore, as our confession states, that God, the Father, is like, I don't know what the language that they use, I can't remember off the top of my head, but the primary, and he communicates his deity to the Son. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right. I mean, all Orthodox theology says that there is some sort of order, let's say, not chronological order, but some sort of order within the Trinity. So you see this in patristic theology or early Christian theology, that the Father begets, and the Son is eternally begotten. The Spirit proceeds from. There's an eternal procession from the Father through the Son. So how to think about that? That's the question and the debate there. And Arminius is just channeling some early Christian theologians who would say, yes, that the deity also, that as the Father as the source of divinity, that's a very Orthodox way of speaking about the Father. In Trinitarian relations, he is the source of divinity, that the Son also receives, his personality in that sense and deity from the Father. If he is begotten by the Father. Not created, again, I want everybody to understand this is not a chronological thing, a point in time. There never was when the Son was not, okay? But there is a reception of whatever divinity is, deity, from the Father. And so in that sense, Arminius was reluctant to, without qualification anyway, just say that the Son is God on his own. He thought that seems to actually separate the Son from the Father. And that's not Trinitarianism by anyone's count. But Arminius is certainly closer to the tradition and to the Reformed way of thinking. Some Reformed held to this, by the way, as well, and were Arminian on this point. So they're certainly closer to the Reformed than they are to the Socinians. The Socinians not only would reject that the Son is autotheos, they would reject that he is theos in any sense. Okay, For the Socinians, it's more like Arianism. He is not fully God in any sense. They were trying to protect the unity of the Father. He is something more like a creature, a high angel, if we want to put it that way. Later, Unitarians would just say he's just a mortal man who was, given the spirit of divinity at his baptism or whatever, sort of adoptionist Christology.
So is it correct then to say like that they held to the Remonstrants held to the eternal not for the terminology, but Christ is eternally begotten. That's the word I want to use.
Yes, for sure. Certainly the 17th century Remonstrance that a lot of people are, where a lot of this debate is. Episcopius and others would have said that. I'm not sure where they start. I can't recall now where you start losing that language. But yeah, the early Arminius himself for sure, and the early Remonstrants were classically orthodox when it comes to these doctrine of God and Christology issues.
Was there any major differences where the Remonstrants, after Arminius did departed? I'm thinking of Hugo Grotius, where he held to or developed a moral government theory, which is often associated with Wesleyanism, but not Wesley. Wesley himself didn't hold to that view. I know Jacob Arminius held to the penal satisfaction view. If you can confirm that.
Arminius on the atonement seems to be pretty much reformed, as far as I can tell. And there was development on that. I would say, again, biblical interpretation methods is a point of discontinuity. You're asking about, where the development happened. There was, I would say, with Limborch especially, you can see a little more openness to that semi-Pelagianism. I still wouldn't call him a Pelagian or anything like that, but I just mean the language of works seems to be more important when it comes to salvation. And it's sometimes hard to tell, is he talking about just sanctification or is he talking about justification also? There seems to be more openness to that kind of language that his opponents certainly would say that sounds more semi-Pelagian. So there, I would say, some evidence that inclines in that direction. And then, by the 18th century on, it's just a little a more rapid rise of Enlightenment type thinking that permeates the instruments anyway. I know we talk about English Arminianism, that's a different animal as well. We've just kind of been talking about Remonstrance here, but
yeah, because I do remember you going into the Methodist people, which is a little bit later on. Would you would you make any which distinctions, I should say, would you make that are different when you look at the Methodist theology of Arminianism compared to the Remonstrance and Jacob Arminius? Is there any major one that comes to your mind that you would say like this is one variation to tell the difference between the two?
Not really. I mean, this is more my colleague Tom McCall's and co-author on these books, I should say, more his wheelhouse. But to my mind, particularly with the later Wesleyan stuff, I've read a good bit in Wesley, John Wesley for sure. But it does seem to me like Wesley has perhaps a more robust view of original sin than Arminius.
I get that too, actually, from his writings. Yeah, like Wesley really wanted to say, that he was in line with Augustine and, identical with the reformers on this regard, where you look at Jacob Arminius and he held, he wanted to stress that privation more so than like a bent or a posture towards sin.
Yeah, so that's a possible conclusion. I would say with Wesley, and I would say Wesleyanism, you get not much more, a little more emphasis on what they call entire sanctification and even perfection. So you don't see quite as much of that in Arminius. But I want to say with these things, those things are inherent in it's part of that seed there in Arminius himself. Vis-a-vis the Reformed, he certainly had a more robust doctrine, I would say, of sanctification and expectations for the life of sanctification and the goal of perfection than his Reformed colleagues would usually be comfortable expressing. So I think this is part of the legacy of that, if you want to call it Arminianism or anti-Calvinism, that is that's there and taken up by the Wesleys.
Well, you've given us a fantastic overview. Is there any final work that or final word that you want to leave us with? And also, would you what books would you recommend people to start with if they want to investigate these things? I'll leave two of the books that I showed in the description. Is there any other books or anywhere that they can follow you, Keith?
On these issues in particular, yeah, those would be the two to start with. Jacob Arminius, and then after Arminius, if folks are interested in sort of the Remonstrant and the switch to the British side, Wesleyan side of all of that. If you're interested more in the doctrine of salvation and assurance of salvation, what I sum up in Jacob Arminius, a lot of that is dealt with in my book from 2007, Arminius on the Assurance of Salvation. It's European publisher, so it's a little more expensive, but your library should have it, or if they don't, you should tell them to get it. But that's where I talk a lot about that. That would be what I would recommend. I've got another book on Arminius, as I said, coming out probably in a couple of years is the due date on that, which means I should start on that very soon.
You were talking 2028, 2027?
I think it's contracted for 2026. So,
well, thank you so much for coming on, and to our audience, if you can please like and share, that'd be fantastic. Don't forget, we're on Apple and Spotify. This has been a great episode discussing Arminius and after Arminius, the Remonstrance. And take care, and God bless you all.